From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. And as we record this, it is the morning after the midterms. How you feeling, David? A little hungover or what?
Well, I think we dodged a bullet. It could have been a lot worse, so I'm satisfied.
All right. And we also have the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, everybody. We're going to have a great show today. People of great political incisiveness.
Yes, I'm all about these midterms. And though we don't know everything just yet, we do know that the Democrats managed to flip the House by at least 27 seats. That may grow as more returns come in. We also know that the Republicans held on to the Senate and actually increased their margin by a few seats. And we also know that a record number of women were elected to Congress. So today we're going to talk about the aftermath, what happened, why it happened, what's going to happen as a result. And the question I'm most curious about is how these results influence the course of the Democratic Party. So here to help us analyze what happened is our old friend Mark Green, former Nader's Raider, public advocate of New York, and someone who knows all the inside baseball of the political process as both a commentator and a participant. That'll be in the first half of the show. In the second half of the show, we take you to Wisconsin, where we will welcome law professor and activist Joel Rogers, who will give us his view from that state, which just ousted the notorious two-term anti-union governor Scott Walker. As always, we will take a minute to check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. And if we have time left over, Ralph will answer more of your questions. But first, let's break down what happened on Tuesday. David?
Mark Green is a former Nader's Raiders. He ran Public Citizens Congress Watch for 10 years. After that, he went on to found his own public interest organization, the New Democracy Project. In addition, he was elected New York City's first public advocate. An author and a radio and TV commentator, Mark's latest book, which we have talked about previously on this show, is entitled Bright Infinite Future, a generational memoir on the progressive rise. His previous book is entitled Losing Our Democracy, which Ralph Nader not only highly recommends, it's a book he often rereads. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Mark Green.
Thanks. I'm excited to do it on this day.
Welcome indeed, Mark. Your book, Losing Our Democracy, which came out in 2006, could have been written today. How are we losing our democracy?
There's a natural progressive majority in this country, but it's not reflected in who's elected or selected if you're talking about Donald Trump. So there's obviously some misconnect in a democracy where our rulers are supposed to reflect the opinions of voters. And we now have a situation where we have a president who didn't win a plurality of the vote. A couple of days ago, we had a House where Democrats won the majority of the vote but didn't control the Congress because of voter suppression, gerrymandering, dark money. And so, Ralph, actually, you're the only person I've ever met who said to me, not that you read a book of mine, but that you reread a book of mine. I don't even reread my books.
Well, I recommend everybody to get this book, Losing Our Democracy, because it's not just an analysis of how we're losing our democracy, but in Mark Green's fashion over the years, he proposes reforms, many of them simple, many of them from places like Canada, Western Europe, and many of them don't cost anything, but they shift power from the few to the many and produce a productive democracy. So continue on this theme.
The thing that infuriates me, forget left, right, Democrat, Republican. You know, we have a capitalist system which relies on people keeping their word when they enter into contracts. And if contracts are constantly violated, we couldn't have a functioning competitive economy. We have a democracy which is based on people's votes. We have a Republican Party is systematically stealing votes from occasional voters, mostly younger people, millennials, elderly minorities who may not have a driver's license or a voter ID. And we saw the likelihood that the Secretary of State of Georgia, Mr. Kemp, is a couple of points ahead of Stacey Abrams, the Democratic nominee for governor in Georgia. And he's running the election that he's in. No man can be a judge in his own case, said common law. And they were systematically erasing people from the polls because they didn't have a hyphen between the middle and the last name. This is willful, should be criminal when you steal the vote of somebody in a democracy. And voters, everyone talks about in 2016, Donald Trump won despite not having a plurality, maybe because of Putin or WikiLeaks or Comey. If you take out the Republican voter suppression in key states, Hillary Clinton would be president. That alone shows how we're losing our democracy. And I look forward, for the first time in my lifetime, to a democracy agenda being a voting issue. It's an issue among the people on this radio show, among prime Democrats, but rarely in a general election where war, peace, health, jobs are predominant. Well, I think because of all the Republican shenanigans on voter suppression and gerrymandering and dark money from the Koch brothers, someone's going to run for president on the Democratic side and be the nominee who's going to talk, not exclusively, but in a primary way, about how crazy it is the world's greatest democracy is not a democracy.
That's what President Carter has said. Jimmy Carter, who monitors elections since he left office in many countries around the world, and he has several requirements before he goes to monitor them. He says the U.S. couldn't meet its own requirements. And he said it this way: U.S. is no longer a democracy. So what's holding back the Democratic Party from adopting major reforms and major transformations of our society that are majority supported? Some of the minimum wage, full Medicare, it's up to 65, 70, 80%, breaking up the big banks that are too big to fail, cracking down on corporate crime, ending corporate subsidies, starting with stadiums and arenas in the sports world. I mean, you have large conservative liberal voters support. Why don't they tap into that?
Well, some do. I don't know anyone who's talked more about minimum wage than you, Ralph. And Nancy Pelosi, after the House went Democratic, said one of the top 2 or 3 things is an increase in the minimum wage, which, as you know, 30 million people are sort of back to what they were in real dollars earning in the 1960s. The reason is that popular opinion is not reflected in public policy, is the circuit breaker of money, one party stealing votes, which doesn't let, until now, Democrats change the policy. Now, Democrats, as we all know, did reform to an extent the campaign finance system in 1974 because of the huge phenomenon of Watergate. And that law has controlled, but has been weakened, campaign spending ever since. And so, frankly, it turns on willfulness. Ralph, we both know Michael Waldman. He's a friend of both of ours, was Bill Clinton's chief speechwriter. He told the story in a book about how Clinton said, I want campaign finance reform. And in 1993, the then speaker, Tom Foley, said, very nice, but we have to do other things first. We'll get to it. And, a new president, not experienced nationally, said, okay. They never got back to it. And so if a Elizabeth Warren or a Bernie Sanders were elected president and they said they want the reforms that were very easy reforms, vote by mail, Oregon has 70% turnout compared to the 40% of other states. Why do we vote on Tuesdays? Because a century ago, farmers went to the market and that was the best day. Well, this is 21st century. If they push a democracy agenda, and in fact, pick a democracy czar in the White House, a joke intended, to remind that Democratic president every week, don't forget about fixing the car's engine, because if the engine is broken, the car can't go forward on any other issues.
Well, are you for universal voting as a civic duty? We have a Bill of Rights. The only duty in the Constitution is inferred jury duty. Australia has universal voting. They don't spend much money begging people to come out to vote. If you're sick, you get an exemption, but they come in 96, 97% turnout. And the civil liberties issue can be handled by putting a binding none of the above on the ballot and a visible write-in option. So you can vote for the candidates, or if you don't like them, you can vote against them, none of the above, or you can vote for a candidate of your choice through a write-in. What do you think of that?
I want our listeners to know that 40 years ago, when I worked as a young public interest lawyer for Ralph, we would interview law school applicants to be Naders Raters. This was a question Ralph and I often asked, simply as a way of seeing if people could think on their feet. And so, like you, Ralph, like Australia, like some Western European countries, I'm in favor of, don't call it compulsory voting, because that offends America's freedom spirit, but it could work. But I don't think that's going to happen in the next 2 to 4 years. So I think a better next step is automatic voter registration, AVR. 18 states now have it. Basically, nationally, it would mean, hey, you turn 18, well, maybe you have to register for the draft. Oh, you're allowed to vote. And one thing that happens is, since the computers have everyone's name and Social Security, is you're automatically entitled to vote unless, you show that you've done something unlawful, you voted twice, which almost never happens. Right now, of course, these state secretaries of state in Republican states are hunting for reasons after Chief Justice Roberts overturned the key parts of the Voting Rights Act and is inciting voter suppression. The presumption should be you can vote, not that you can vote unless you jump through hoops, as if it were a literacy test in the 1950s. So automatic voter registration, make Election Day a holiday, perhaps on a weekend, as New York City has, a 6-to-1 match of public monies to private campaign dollars. And so we have far more people of color and working people in our legislature, the city council, not at the mayoral level, because Mike Bloomberg, under the constitutional law for now, was able to spend his own money. But that could change when the court changes, Supreme Court. It doesn't seem like it's going to happen tomorrow.
Well, how about adding this? Haven't you been intrigued by all this voter suppression, blocking people from one of the cardinal rights they have
right
in a democratic society? Nobody gets prosecuted. Secretary of States don't get prosecuted like Mr. Kemp in Georgia. They don't get convicted, of course. It's not considered a felony. You're more likely to face enforceable law with a minor traffic ordinance violation, a parking violation, than you are as a government official obstructing your right to vote or blocking your right to vote. Why isn't there an effort by the Democratic Party to make this an enforceable criminal violation that's prosecuted?
Well, if any of the potential presidential Democratic aspirants, and I'm in touch with some of them, ask me, that should be part of their democracy agenda. Now, a procedural problem, for example, you presume that district attorneys follow the rule of law. Every so often you get one who's a racist, who hides evidence to convict some minority defendant. But to prove that they have abused the process is very hard, because it goes to intent, which is not a number. It's not like you can vote at 18. It's hard to discern intent. Well, I think it should be a felony. If you can show, this is a hypothetical, if Kemp in Georgia is shown to have, okay, let's take voting machines and sites away from Atlanta because that's a majority community, so I win the next governor's race. If you have memos saying something like that, he should be prosecuted. I'm sure there are memos saying that if there were Robert Mueller looking into it in the state of Georgia. But it's hard to implement because it goes to intent, and it's easy to cover up if you're the party in power, as Republicans have been in Georgia, as they've been in Congress. So the more realistic reforms revolve around matching public money the day of the election, voting by mail, automatic voting registration when you turn 18, and states like Governor Schwarzenegger in the day did, having nonpartisan panels draw congressional lines so you avoid the gerrymandering, the salamander type districts where elected officials pick their voters rather than voters pick their officials. California's done it. Other states have done it. It should be a national mandate.
You know, Western Europeans are stunned when we tell them that politicians in power carve the electoral districts. That would be a serious crime in Western European countries because all nonpartisan civil servants do the demarcation of electoral districts. So that's how far we are behind. Let's move to what's going to be in the news very shortly, Mark Green. We're talking with Mark Green, many times a candidate, sometimes a winner, author of over 23 books or co-author. And he's been watching carefully the Trump administration. Robert Mueller is going to make his move pretty soon, probably before the end of the year, and it's going to involve Trump, not just Trumpsters. He's already gotten some indictments and convictions of high-level Trump associates. Do you think our country is ready, certainly as ready as Trump is, for the constitutional crisis coming up? Trump's ready to go to crowds all over the country and mobilize them, darkly intimating to me violence in the streets as he did during his campaign if he wasn't nominated or elected. Instead, he was selected by the Electoral College. He has the pardon power. He can flaunt all kinds of sue me threat dares. He can replace the Justice Department with people like Rudy Giuliani. Is our country ready for this constitutional crisis that's coming up?
I don't think so. I'm not a big fan of Richard Nixon, but he didn't have rallies inciting violence to people who own most of the guns. He didn't have a Fox News being, in effect, an extension of the Trump campaign. And so when the crisis happened, there were some moderate Republicans who said, wait, there's evidence that you've committed a crime, obstruction of justice, that payoffs to people who were Watergate burglars. You're gone. Today, Trump would say, how do you spell burglars? What do you mean? You're a crook. He'll take words, as a good demagogue can do it, exaggerate the aberrational and presume it's commonplace. And his voters don't care about facts, logic, and law. This is not me being condescending. Ask them. A voter from Wyoming, a woman said, I don't think he tells the truth, but I trust him. It's a pretty amazing quote. And others said, I think Trump's crazy, but I like what he thinks. So you're dealing with people who are allowed to have a vote. They are 40% of the country, but not 60% of the country. And it's going to turn on, it was an almost fair election earlier week. And so the Democrats now control one chamber and can issue subpoenas to expose and stop much of Trump's corruption. The tiebreaker, Ralph, will be if Mueller can indict and issue a report carefully documenting Trump's illegality. If Mueller comes out with a report in the next month, and I'm sure Mueller has his tax returns, that Trump, and this is more likely than not, has committed extensive financial crimes, money laundering, Russian money in his hotels, in his businesses. Those are crimes. Obstruction is on the face of it, the Russian meeting in Trump Towers in June of 2016. This country is going to have to face whether they believe in the rule of law or the law of rule, whether they believe in our tradition of law or they favor a dictator in waiting. And it's going to be up to Congress and the Supreme Court to stand up to him. I wouldn't bet on the Supreme Court after Kavanaugh's confirmation, but that'll be a test because law is not what's on paper. It's what the people believe. And Russia has a constitution that seems pretty democratic on paper, but it's not complied with because people understand it with a wink and a nod. If that happens, then America's not America.
Well, do you think that the legal profession, 1.3 million lawyers, enlightened businesses who can see the economy tanking if there is, in effect, a flouting fundamental law in this country by the President of the United States following the moves by Robert Mueller in the Justice Department? Do you think that the academic world, you think they're up to it? I mean, they're going to have to respond as they did in the Nixon Watergate. I mean, one senator from Tennessee during the Watergate crisis got 40,000 telegrams in 2 days after Nixon fired 3 top officials in the Justice Department. Are we ready?
I think Republican politicians in Congress violated their oath of office which includes oversight over the executive branch, checks and balances. And they never held Trump accountable for his scandals, his illegalities, his cell phone use that's overheard after he bellyached about Hillary's compromised server. Now the Democrats control a branch. But lawyers who don't have to fear re-election, they don't have to fear for their livelihood if Trump tweets against them. I do believe hundreds of lawyers will say you've crossed the line. But Ralph, when lawyers did that in Turkey, Erdogan just laughed and ignored them. When 1,000 lawyers objected to Kavanaugh because of both his judicial opinions and his temperament, obviously the political process forced him through. I think lawyers will stand up. The question is, will judges, the Supreme Court, do what the court under Nixon did, which is vote unanimously, nothing at the time, that his tapes could be subpoenaed? And if a Supreme Court votes, let's say, 6-3 against Trump, will Trump do what Nixon never did? Nixon didn't burn the tapes. Physically, he could have. He controlled them. Trump, none of us put past him his interest in doing whatever advances him and his family's wealth. That's a crisis we've never had in this country, other than the lawlessness of April 1861 over slavery.
It's interesting, just from our listeners' point of view, what do they say to themselves as interested citizens here, that their role is to back up some members of Congress, regardless of party, who are inclined to stand up to Trump and move constitutional processes from impeachment to conviction in the Senate? Right now, the Democrats don't want to talk about impeachment, but if all constitutional hell breaks loose and you have Trump violating all kinds of federal laws and constitutional provisions and doing it in his self-interest, not just his political interests, but his wealth interests and his family interests and his connections with rich people overseas, what do you say to our listeners?
Well, we have a problem in this country. Allow me, I'm a Democrat, obviously. One party profits from, politically prospers from, racism, lying, and nativism. And if you say to them, hey, your guy has lied 6,500 times in 2 years, according to independent fact finders, they go, well, there was a day that Bill Clinton once didn't tell the truth. Well, it's a both sides-ism, so they can look in the mirror and look at their children and explain, but they know in their stomach, they just care about the next election, not the United States Constitution. And so I have no confidence that a Mitch McConnell or the next Republican leader of the House will suddenly grow a conscience. And so it's up to voters in 2020, courts at all levels, to do what we've done for 230 years, or our democratic experiment could end, and look at what's happening in Brazil, Turkey, the Philippines, Hungary, Poland, Italy. All have paper democracies, but are being run by authoritarians whose playbook, from Lenin to Hitler to Arte, is be the strong man, pose that you're on the side of working people while you transfer trillions of dollars to your wealthy donors. That's not democracy.
The ultimate nightmare is the people electing dictatorial regimes who then oppress them. And that's what's been happening in some of these countries. They can say, oh, the people elected him or her. What are you complaining about? David, Steve, you want to jump in here? Any comments?
Yes. You guys were around for the Powell memo. Can you look back and say the right was smart enough to say, let's make the American people so craven, so stupid, they'll keep us in power? Was there a conscious decision to dumb down the American people?
The Powell memo, not Colin Powell, but Lewis Powell, very prominent Southern lawyer, Nixon put him on the Supreme Court. And before the court, he wrote a memo to his clients at Chamber of Commerce, which laid out how to fight Ralph Nader. That's not apocryphal. That's true. That was in the memo. And they laid out how to spend money on think tanks and elections. And slowly over time, big donor interests followed this rule book. And then eventually it led to Reagan, Newt Gingrich, and now Donald Trump. And they have led to one of the great parties in our country being a place of immorality, amorality, and lawlessness and untruths.
But were they prescient enough to know that the only way they could keep their power is by making the American people immoral and stupid?
You're
How
asking
brilliant
the wrong
were they?
guy.
How brilliant were
Meaning, I don't know what they knew. And look, I have to admit to naivete. If you had asked me 3 years ago, not would Donald Trump be president, I would have said no and been wrong with a lot of people. But if you had said to me, what percentage of the American public harbor racial resentment and would believe a demagogue every day and want to keep immigrants out even though they're immigrants, I would have said 25%, which is a number throughout Western Europe, cultures comparable to ours. I was wrong. It turns out it's 40%. And the difference means that a president's been selected, and until this week, we had a Republican Senate and House. And so did Lewis Powell and his flock know the American people better than I did, or many of us did, 3 years ago? Maybe. Am I in a coastal bubble where I don't meet people who didn't go to college and are not fair-minded? Yeah, maybe you could say that of me. But you don't give up. And eventually, if we don't believe Benjamin Franklin, that in the long term, if truth and error have their day, truth will always win out. If you don't believe that, then you can't have a democracy. No one is smart enough to be a pessimist, Norman Cousins once wrote. And my wife laughs at me that I'm a cockeyed optimist. I don't really know the alternative.
Mark, the Democrats, as the commentators will tell you, ran a lot on healthcare. But centrist Democrats will tell you they were running on the fear of taking away the provision for pre-existing conditions, that they weren't running on Medicare for all, and that Medicare for all is not a winning issue for Democrats. What do you think about that?
Well, Medicare for all polls very high. Greater access to health care from Teddy Roosevelt to Lyndon Johnson were no doubt popular. But interest groups of the day, the American Medical Association especially, scare the hell out of people. Socialized medicine, premiums will go up. Nothing happened. And then President Johnson won an overwhelming victory in 1964 and the master legislator and got enacted Medicare and Medicaid. Well, Medicare for all is a great phrase because people like Medicare because, it's universal at a certain age. And if everybody has access to health care, that sounds pretty good. The Koch brothers did a study showing how much it would cost people. The study showed how much it would save people. So I think single payer is a bad term because what does that mean? Sounds like you go to a bank. And so we have to be respectful of language here. Let me say to listeners, as Ralph knows so well, at Ralph Nader is his Twitter handle, and he, like on radio and in his books, says things no one else does. Well, I created a shadow cabinet, and it's at Shadowing Trump. And it's a leading experts agency by agency. So like Lawrence Tribe is our attorney general. David K. Johnston, the Pulitzer Prize winner, is our tax expert. Robert Reich, our economist. So if you go to at Shadowing Trump, it's the Twitter equivalent of the Ralph Nader radio hour.
But do you think that there's going to be a battle in the Democratic Party about whether to run on Medicare for all or just try to rebuild the Affordable Care Act?
Well, it depends on who the nominee is. That is, the Democratic nominee will, in effect, control how the party, what party's program is, not the platform committee, not an individual senator. And right now, if you ask the leading progressives, let's say Sanders and Warren, they would say, you try both at the same time, both are popular, pre-existing conditions is now a term that has broken through. And it's so popular, we also have the Republicans who voted to repeal Obamacare now say, oh, no, we were always for covering the pre-existing conditions. Medicare for all is a little newer. It depends on public education.
But Mark, if you were running, would you run on that?
Yes.
Medicare for all?
Sure. I think it's popular. It's fiscally responsible. And finally, the country is now divided not so much left-right. That's sort of more 50s thinking, although there are people more liberal than conservative in the reverse. It's up-down. Whose side are you on? 1% and 99%. And it's urban-rural, like it or not. And the urban areas are overwhelmingly more professional, wealthy, and liberal. And the rural areas are people who don't see the American dream. They're losing jobs. Real income is going down. Their health care, they're dying. White rural men their life expectancy has gone down in the last 5 years because of the opioid crisis. And so, yeah, I would run on affordable health care for all like it works for Medicare. And if the Democratic nominee embraces that and announces it and wins on it, and then has a Democratic Senate and House along, we'll get it. If you can count that on the reconciliation as a tax measure without getting too detailed.
I'm sorry, but it seems like the first people you have to convince of all of this is the corporate wing of the Democratic Party.
Well, the primaries will determine. The polls are on the side of what you're suggesting. I am.
One last question, Mark. But when you ran against Mr. Bloomberg for mayor of New York City, you have a funny story to tell that over a month from the election, an advisor came to you with the findings. And he said, the good news is you're 17 points ahead of Michael Bloomberg. The bad news is you're losing 1 point a day because of all the money Michael Bloomberg is spending on television in New York City. What's your view of Michael Bloomberg's future prospects? Do you think he's going to run for the Democratic nomination in 2020 for president?
I would have given you a different answer 2 weeks ago, which is he always flirts with being president. Obviously, the guy has a rather big ego. Most people would if you're that wealthy and that successful. But as you know, Ralph, and you've spoken to Bloomberg about this when he was toying with it in other cycles, he said how the country is D or R and independents don't win. An independent hasn't won the presidency since 1860. Well, he now re-registered as a Democrat, has given $110 million, which even for him is real money, to the Democrats to win the House. And he spent $5 million on a very highly produced ad, let's unify the country, unlike Trump, that aired on 60 Minutes. So 20 million people saw it. You add all that together, Ralph,
yeah.
I think he's gone from a 1-4 to a 2-4 chance of running. But he's a long shot because while money is good, message beats it among prime Democrats. And the Democrats who run against him will have millions to advertise, even if he has billions. And his views on stop and frisk and Social Security and taxes are anathema to the Democratic base. And so his money can be pretty effective in a general election, trust me. But I don't see him winning Democratic primaries.
And he's only going to run in the Democratic Party.
Correct.
He's not going to run as an independent. Well,
Correct.
Thank you very much, Mark Green, author of a wonderful memoir, Bright Infinite Future, author of the signally relevant book, Losing Our Democracy. To be continued.
Thanks so much, Ralph. Enjoyed it.
We have been speaking to Mark Green, author of Losing Our Democracy and Bright Infinite Future, a generational memoir on the progressive rise. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Now we're going to take a short break and get the latest news from Russell Mokhiber on the real crime wave sweeping the country, the corporate one. You are listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Don't go away.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, November 9, 2018. I'm Russell Mokhiber. The Securities and Exchange Commission and the Justice Department are investigating General Electric's power business. That's according to a disclosure made by General Electric to the SEC last week. General Electric said the SEC is investigating the company's $22 billion write-down of its power division. The news comes just weeks after General Electric tossed CEO John Flannery and replaced him with Larry Culp. In 2009, General Electric paid $50 million to settle Securities and Exchange Commission charges that the company used, quote, overly aggressive accounting, unquote, to make false and misleading statements to investors. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman and Ralph. Now we go to Madison, Wisconsin, to get the view of the midterms from there. David?
Joel Rogers is a professor of law, political science, public affairs, and sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Professor Rogers has written widely on American politics and democratic theory and has worked with and advised many politicians and social movement leaders. He's a contributing editor of The Nation and Boston Review, a MacArthur Foundation Genius Fellow, and was identified by Newsweek as one of the 100 living Americans most likely to shape U.S. politics and culture in the 21st century. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Joel Rogers.
Great to be here.
And Joel, as you know, you've been called a public intellectual, but you're a lot more than that. You're a doer, you're a strategist. You've worked with citizen groups at all levels of government, local, state, federal. You've advised labor unions. You've proposed all kinds of plans, strategies, agendas. So with that background, give us your take on the congressional elections, from voter turnout to where you think the Democrats and Republicans are ending up.
Well, I was pleased at the increase in turnout. I was naturally distressed by the antics of Kemp and many other people to suppress the vote. I was pleased at the re-endorsement all over the place of minimum wage and other sort of broadly populist demands. I was particularly pleased by the Florida repeal of its ridiculously punitive law restricting the suffrage to formerly convicted people who'd served their time and done their probation and everything. Now it's a divided government. That's great. I'm delighted that, Emmanuel and other people have the subpoena power now. Maybe we'll finally see the famous tax returns and see this guy for the utter fraud that he is. I don't think it's going to make a huge amount of difference in terms of legislation going forward. I hope the Democrats are sensible enough to stay clear of trying to impeach the guy, but instead stick to their guns, try to do some serious anti-corruption bill, some serious infrastructure bill. If it's serious, it'll be voted down by the Senate, and Trump will veto it, and that'll be it. Or he won't need to veto it because it won't get through the Congress. But the next couple of years do give the Democrats an opportunity to do what Sanders, Warren, you, and a variety of other political leaders inside and outside the Democratic Party have repeatedly urged them to do, which is to show concrete stuff that they can do to help people and re-empower the democracy.
What would you anticipate in terms of how tough the Democrats are going to be in the House under probably Nancy Pelosi vis-a-vis the administration? Toughening oversight, subpoenas, putting forth progressive legislation, getting it through the House, even though they know it's going to be blocked in the Senate to set the stage for 2020. What are the 5 or 6 major initiatives you think the Democrats should take?
They should go directly at the corruption of the democracy itself, starting with voting rights through campaign finance, the whole corrupt system of reapportionment, repealing the Electoral College, a variety of other things. They should fix the democracy, or try to fix the democracy, or have a plan for how to fix the democracy. On the economy, you can start with infrastructure, an obscure term that puts people to sleep all the time, but basically refers to the variety of public goods, both physical and social, that we need for a flourishing society. I hope that if they limit themselves to the physical infrastructure and transportation, electricity, and the whole energy network system, that they do so in a relatively green way, attentive to the fact that we're in the process of cheerfully destroying the biosphere on which we all depend. And I hope they have the gumption to put some serious standards, not just Buy American, but also wage standards on the compensation of the people doing the work. As to how strong they'll be, you know this territory better than I, but the Democratic Party, especially with moderate Dems that are recently, re-entered the scene, it's not exactly been the disciplined paladin of the proletariat that we all hope it would be. But I have a fair amount of respect for Pelosi's discipline and her ability to herd cats. So I'm cautiously hopeful that you have a decent anti-corruption thing, a decent infrastructure thing done, and then they can also, lock down some revised version of the ACA as a permanent achievement, really the only permanent achievement of the Obama administration in terms of helping to complete a little bit the American welfare state. What I'd like them to do, but have no expectation of them doing, let me just ramble on here, is to do something serious about intergovernmental relations. My impression is that when the Democrats, like the Republicans, get to Washington, they think only of Washington. And I would very much like to see Steny Hoyer's suggestion of reintroducing earmarks. I like that idea. I'd mostly like to see a progressive federalism articulated by somebody of the sort that you and I have talked about many times. Higher federal floors, but then no ceilings at all on state innovation and municipal innovation consistent with the purposes of those floors. That's what I think we really need to revive democracy. You got to make local government more interesting and more impactful for people.
They have H.R. 676 pending in the House for years. That's the single payer. That's the gold standard. Right. And 130 Democrats last year signed up for it, and this year. Now the Democrats will control the House. They'll have probably a margin of 10 to 11 seats. Two questions. To what extent are they going to go forward with single payer, which increasingly has a majoritarian support, including conservatives who like to have health care like anyone else? And to what extent do you think the Democrats will deal with the transaction tax on Wall Street, which is long overdue, public banking, which is widely supported when people understand it? What about those kinds of frontiers?
Well, it would be great if they did. Are you asking what's my calculation on the likelihood that they'll lead with those things? I don't know about the financial transaction cost. I haven't counted votes or looked at particular people within the Democratic Party recently on that. Single payer has been there for more or less forever. Medicare for all maybe is a better way of messaging the thing. You've got 130 Democrats, so that's less than, just over a majority of Democrats. The Republicans are, of course, completely opposed to it. I don't see it really taking off in this Democratic Congress. But it would not be the first time, as you repeatedly pointed out, that the Democratic Congress is certainly not enacting the things that the people would like it to enact, or taking the trouble to explain those things in the simple, accessible terms that are generally needed to separate the signal from all the noise of distortion and other things that we have in our system.
Before we get to the loss of Scott Walker in your home state of Wisconsin,
nice
the
thing,
Democrats,
pretty cool, huh?
Yeah. The Democrats basically have been giving the Republicans a huge advantage because they don't have really a national immigration policy. They don't have a national tax policy. We're talking about the National Democrats. They certainly don't have a national labor policy. They talk the right words on a national public works or public goods policy, but they're not willing to fight the tax and the public budgets battles with the Republicans to shift money from the bloated military budget and the corporate welfare budget to rebuilding communities all over the country with good paying jobs that can't be exported. They certainly don't have an alternative military and foreign policy. They're on the same page pretty much with the Republicans on empire. Who's going to take the lead besides people you've been working with, at least to put some of these alternative models on the frontiers of public visibility?
Well, I thought that the legislations that Bernie has offered, that Elizabeth Warren have offered, have at least done some of the bills that could begin to frame some of at least the domestic discussions. I agree with you, by the way, and we should come back to it if we have any time, on the incredible moral bankruptcy of the Democrats and all the empire stuff. But it's one thing to have a bill out there that you can aim at. As you said, the single payer thing has been out there for some time now. It's another to get attention from the media, which is largely silent on anything of, substantive interest. And so I don't see it ever coming from anything other than mobilizations from the ground up, connecting lots of different people, swelling, and eventually breaking through into general public consciousness. I think that this is why the local actually matters, because there are people in your neighborhood you can talk to, and they can talk to other people, and you can move up. All I was saying on the progressive federalism stuff is it would be nice to at least let organized localities be able to show the benefits locally of that self-organization. But, I'm a democracy guy, Ralph.
Yeah.
I think in the end it's just going to be self-organization of people treating each other with equal respect, learning what's going on, talking their values, insisting that here the people rule or should rule and do not at present.
Well, here's an interesting observation. Let's lower our expectations and say, will the Democrats hold tough public hearings on all these substantive redirections and transformations for our nation that are long overdue and have majoritarian support we've talked about endlessly on this radio hour?
Right.
Will they have public hearings so that they educate the press, they educate the public, they raise expectations? Will they put in the hopper HR XYZ so people can mobilize around an existing piece of legislation that's in the House Ways and Means Committee, the House Judiciary Committee, the House Armed Services Committee? And will they throw the Trumpsters on the defensive with rigorous oversight and subpoenas and disclosing Trump's tax return? Now, can't we expect them to do at least that?
Well, no, I don't think we can expect them to do even that without some pressure. But I think that is an excellent suggestion of very constructive pressure. Constructive because it does not presume that they have more power than, in fact, they do. But the Democrats could, in addition to broadly framing their own agenda, they could use their powers and public hearings and publicity of those public hearings to actually help frame the considerations that should go into framing the general public agenda. I totally agree with that suggestion.
And Joel, people should know, our listeners should know that Joel Rogers has drafted a lot of legislation. And if all this legislation to change our political economy, from election reform to labor rights to consumer protection to cracking down on corporate crime, he led the fight against ALEC, the Koch brothers' terrible lobby at the state legislative level. What about you sending a lot of these drafted bills, and we can get them introduced in Congress after they clear the drafts people in the House, and we can put them in. And if the chair of the committees don't want to put them in, like they have refused for years to do so, other than HR 676, we'll get several members of the Congress who are progressive who will put them in. Every time I go up to the House and I say, why aren't you making a higher minimum wage a big issue? 30 million workers adjusted for inflation since 1968 are making less than workers made in 1968, and they have higher expenses. They say, oh, because Paul Ryan or Speaker Boehner, they won't let us get to first base. I said, but you laid the groundwork. You make it an election issue. So will you send a lot of these statutes, especially with your colleagues, so that we can work them and get them installed and start getting the press talking about it and getting citizen groups back home to have something to organize around?
Well, yeah, I don't want to exaggerate how much stuff I have, especially at the federal level. But of course, I will give you anything I have. And I want to emphasize here, and I hope your listeners hear this, is the idea of at least getting Democrats to do a series of hearings in major areas of manifest public concern, the cost of empire, the threats of global warming and other disruption of the biosphere that we're doing, the need for investment in all kinds of public goods, physical infrastructure, but also education, healthcare services, a variety of other things.
Corporate crime.
And then the need to the deformation of our democracy that's going on over the last 50 years, from the corporate crime stuff to everything else that we know about. The big idea I think you have here, which I really want to endorse and want your listeners to hear, is that is a minimal constructive thing the Democrats could do, which would be very constructive by informing the public and then helping the public shape its attitudes, opinions, et cetera, going into the 2020 election.
Let's go to Scott Walker in Wisconsin, your home state. What's your read on that?
Well, it's great to, as I told Tony and Mandela and Sarah Godlewski and Josh Call, all of whom won, last night. It was just great to wake up with a little bit more hope in this state. It was a terrific victory. It was very hard fought. No one in particular should claim credit for it. I thought Maggie Gao did a great job with the campaign. She was later joined by Amanda Brink, who'd run Tony's DPI campaign earlier. This gets more into the weeds than you need. But basically, the students came out. Black Milwaukee showed up. The union leaders were very good. And, La Crosse and Stevens Point showed up, as well as Madison and Milwaukee. And it was a great thing. It was in the end, it was 30,000 votes, which may seem trivial at the national level, but is not so trivial at the Wisconsin level.
Well, Governor Scott Walker and his venomous attack on labor and consumer and people rights generally is now going to...
And the environment, Ralph.
And the environment. And the environment and fooling around with election procedures and stifling dissent in the legislature. He is now going to be thrown out of office. But isn't it true that the Republicans still have a hold on the legislature?
They do, but they don't have a hold of 2/3 in either legislature, as far as I know. Which means
any questions from Steve Scorban or David? Do you have any questions before Joe Rogers has to go for a meeting?
Yes, I want to know just basically what lessons this gives the Democratic Party, because if you listen to the New York Times, they kind of concluded that moderate centrist Democrats won, and therefore that indicates the direction of the Democratic Party. What do you think this says for the Democratic Party in terms of strategy?
Well, that could have been an opinion from the New York Times 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, et cetera. They always say that. I thought what O'Rourke did in Texas was truly remarkable, to make a Senate race in Texas genuinely competitive, as O'Rourke did. The Florida stuff was, of course, very disappointing. I don't know what the final disposition is in Georgia. Maybe you guys do. But I would not read this as, oh, I'm sorry. It just shows that if Democrats have a populist, democratic, values-based, clearly communicated message, they cannot win in America, because America has forsaken anything except a worship of almighty mammon. I just think that's wrong. In terms of the future of the Democratic Party, I'm certainly not a steward on the future of the Democratic Party. I'm not the person whispering in Pelosi or Steny Hoyer's ear. But I think I would not overreact to the relatively narrow defeat of O'Rourke or Stacey Abrams, certainly, as saying that there is no credible, successful, populist, democratic message that cannot win at all. I would not say that at all. The basic problem is that, and you saw this with O'Rourke actually, and with Abrams, is people are not talking enough about core values. It's still too much about particular policy things. This place was dedicated to a proposition, and it was unique in, it may imagine its uniqueness in history, but at the time, at least, it was unique in not being a place of blood or soil, but of principled commitment to the idea that we're all created equal and we're all, entitled to life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. And we're going to do that through this thing called democracy, which we sort of invented in its modern representative form. And we think it's a good way to handle our affairs. People are not talking enough about that.
Joel, just before you leave, just look at the scene here. Some very progressive Democrats were elected to the House of Representatives. The wavering Democrats like Senator Heidi Camp and Senator McCaskill lost, and Senator McCaskill went around the state of Missouri saying, I'm not like those crazy Democrats, and she lost. And I want to leave you with a statement by a near billionaire, Nick Hanauer in Seattle, who writes for Politico. And he said recently, if the Democratic Party does not move markedly to the left, they will not move to where the center is, which is his way of saying all kinds of progressive policies, putting people before giant corporations, all kinds of progressive policies now are an increasing support, majoritarian support. And his statement was, they better move to the left because that's where the center is. That's how he put it.
What do I think of that? I think that's basically right. I mean, people do not believe in trickle-down economics. This is the other thing that Hanauer has been saying for years. They believe in, he calls it middle-out economics. I think it's simpler because you imagine middle class getting fatter and fatter around their waist. I sort of prefer bottom up and middle out economics, but it's certainly not trickle down. No one really believes that they're advantaged by giving corporations more tax breaks. Everybody wants their kid to have a quality education. Everybody knows how important education is. Everybody wants to have high-speed internet connections, not just for the famous overconsumption of porn, but because their kids need it, the health services need it, et cetera, for very, that's a public necessity. If you simply had Democrats say, we are going to have a modern communications and energy system, and we're going to make another run at getting corruption out of government, partly we're talking about, the cardinal sins or the four uglies or whatever you want to call it, essential traits of human nature. You have to watch these things all the time, especially when they're leveraged by, rapacious commercial instincts, with greed, dressed up in different corporate suit type things. But yeah, I agree with Hannah, right? I think the middle, the much misunderstood rural Americans want exactly what most Americans want. They want a future worth fighting for. They want a future that they can think about without feeling sad. And the corporate elites are just destroying that possibility, not just in this country, but, around the world. And they're fed up with that as well.
Listeners, let's rev it up. You heard it from Joel Rogers. Look him up on Google, read his writings, absorb his wisdom and his ever-present optimism, even though he's a realist. Thank you very much, Joel Rogers from the University of
Ralph.
Wisconsin.
Great. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
We've been speaking to law professor and activist Joel Rogers. We will link to his extensive work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. I want to thank our guests again today, Mark Green and Joel Rogers. For those of you listening in the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up. A transcript of this show will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website. And Ralph has 2 new books out, The Fable, How the Rats Reformed the Congress. To acquire a copy of that, go to ratsreformcongress.org. And also To the Ramparts, How Bush and Obama Paved the Way for the Trump Presidency and How It's Not Too Late to Change Course. We will link to that also.
Join us next week when we talk about the intersection of music and politics with the founder of Appleseed Records, Jim Musselman. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Jimmy. And if you want a manual on how to take control of your Congress, 2 senators and representatives at a time, go to ratsreformcongress.org. You'll laugh yourself seriously.
Hi, this is Jimmy Lee Wirt, producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Welcome to the Wrap-Up, where we talk a little more to Mark Green and Ralph answer some listener questions. First, David asks a question of Mark Green.
Could you run for office as a Democrat, being a practitioner of scapegoating? Because, the caravan kind of works. What about scapegoating the Sackler family, Purdue Pharmacy, Aetna, the health insurance companies, naming names? Is there a Democrat who could get elected president the way Roosevelt did, naming names and going after certain people and shaming them?
Of course, Trump did on the other side, and Roosevelt did in a crisis worse than ours today economically. I think we're in a comparable crisis in our democracy. And the answer is, I hear, I'm a supporter, I happen to be a supporter of, among others, Elizabeth Warren. She's constantly naming names. She's constantly ripping Wells Fargo and Citibank by name, doesn't flinch. And when fellow Democrats voted for a farm bill, which was soft on big agriculture, because they said they had to, like John Tester in his state, she called them out. And the Democratic caucus yelled at her for doing it, I know. So the answer is we're in a different era. And the way to run and win is not to do what Claire McCaskill turned out failed to do in Missouri and just be Republican light. But people reward you if you say what you mean, do what you say, the way Andrew Gillum got so close, the way Beto O'Rourke got so close. And that can be a winning message because the country will hate Trump in 2020. So the combination of fear-mongering against Trump and having a positive, progressive policy program, so it's negative and positive, I believe that will win in 2020, based on nothing else, that the House vote earlier this week, Democrats won by 9% over Republicans if you add up all 435 races. 9% is a landslide presidentially.
Were you ever tempted when you were running for mayor to run against Wall Street, to say to them, then leave? Go ahead. You're not the great job creators that you present yourself to be. Leave.
Well, I would have been freer to do it because I don't want to get too parochial with your national audience. But in New York City, we then had a 6-to-1 match. So for someone gave me $175, which is not that much money to certain people, it became over $1,000. So I was not reliant on big corporate PAC Wall Street money. However, Wall Street was a big employer in the city, along with real estate, media, tech. So it's unusual for a candidate to attack a major employer, although I never got many big corporate gifts because people knew I was a Nader Raider, a consumer advocate, etc.
Is Wall Street that big an employer of Manhattan? Do they really provide that many jobs in Manhattan?
Yeah, they provide a lot.
Good jobs.
We count
Good
back
jobs.
offices and stuff.
Good jobs.
It's not equal to real estate or media, but it's more than tech, although tech is rising.
And now Ralph answers some listener questions.
Ralph, this first question comes to us from Elizabeth Angiel. She says, I might have missed this on your excellent recent podcast, but isn't the ability for corporations to deduct nonprofit contributions actually part of the problem here? It's a way that corporations can exert influence over nonprofits' actions and or mission, while at the same time diverting dollars from public use where decisions are made, at least theoretically, in the public realm with some accountability to the people.
A very important question, Elizabeth. I'll give you an example where you're right. Corporations can deduct up to 5% of their adjustable gross income for charity. The overwhelming number of corporations don't even deduct 1%. They don't give more than 1% to charity. And what they do give has often been very, very damaging. But it's a mixed scene. For example, the oil companies gave a lot of deductible contributions to the Congressional Black Caucus years ago, and other corporate contributions to the Black Caucus has almost completely neutralized those members of Congress from a progressive initiatory agenda. We couldn't even get 10 years ago the Black Caucus, when they had important chairpersonships of important House committees, to do investigation of the crimes against minorities in the ghettos in our cities. We had to get Dennis Kucinich, who had a non-legislative subcommittee, to do that in the House of Representatives. So the money that they spend often shuts up people who should be up front for Progressive Caucus. On the other hand, you have Patagonia that gives up to 5% of its income to environmental causes, to the protection of public land causes from the rapacity of the corporatists who want to take over a lot of public lands, to climate disruption opponents, to small environmental groups. And that's very constructive. Of course, Patagonia is a small company compared to ExxonMobil or Goldman Sachs. So overall, two conclusions. Probably from your point of view, it's good that they don't give more than 1%. They don't go up to the 5% they can deduct, these big corporations. And second, overall, they don't make the right waves. The insurance company foundations do not support enough loss prevention and health and safety efforts that challenge corrupt political and government power. So that they lose an opportunity there from their own interest to reduce claims through loss prevention. And of course, the energy corporations, the bank corporations, and others, they spend charitable money to neutralize at the local, state, and national level citizen groups, steer them more to charity and less toward preventative justice.
Well, thank you for that question, Elizabeth. This next question comes from Chuck Aguayo, and he has a question. It's actually pretty relevant to what we're talking about in terms of elections, because he says, I'd love to hear Ralph ask his guests if they've ever considered running for Congress. It seems more pertinent than asking if they've been on PBS or NPR. The guests on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are intelligent, experienced, and articulate advocates for the public interest. In other words, perfect candidates for elected office. If people like this appeared on the ballot instead of the cliche-spouting, corporate-sponsored empty suits we're presented with each November, perhaps the great mass of non-voters would stay home. Has Ralph considered asking this question?
No, it's a pretty good suggestion, but it has certain limitations. One is that we should ask them if they want to run for local office or state office, not just national office. But because I know a lot of these guests, I know what the answer is. They're not interested in running for elective office, either by temperament or because they're preoccupied with their good works, or they have lost past elections and they don't want to run again. But there are times when that question, I think, should be asked. We've had Gayle Mclaughlin, who is the elected mayor of Richmond, California, on, and she was running for lieutenant governor. She lost that race a while back in the primaries in California, but she's now organizing a progressive assembly with a big jamboree in California in March of 2019. Mark Green has lost several races because the Democratic Party in New York essentially abandoned him, races for Congress, races for Attorney General. He was the elected public advocate twice in New York City and distinguished himself. But I'm sure if I asked him that question, he would say, no, he's not running again. So once in a while, it's an appropriate question to ask, but it's always appropriate to ask whether they got on PBS or NPR, because I want our listeners to really pressure NPR and PBS, start putting progressives on, people who've accomplished real change for the betterment of humanity, instead of just putting on corporate Democrats or mealy-mouthed liberals.
Did you ever get deluded and actually think you were going to get elected president? And did you ever consider Senate or Congress?
No, because I wanted to have a national visibility to progressive agendas, to labor, consumer, tax reform, Wall Street subordinated to the rule of law, curtailing empire, de-bloating the military budget, getting rid of corporate handouts, giveaways, protecting small business and farmers, and protecting students from a lifetime of debt from their student loans. You don't get much visibility, even comparatively, if you run for the Senate. And if you run for the Senate or the House on a third party, you know what the two-party duopoly does, even at the local and state level. I miscalculated the disinterest of the mass media in our progressive agenda with the Green Party, which was supported by a majority of the American people, and which was not on the table of the Democrats and Republicans, whether it was Bush Kerry or Gore Bush or McCain Obama. On my website, which I've kept open just for questions like you just asked, David, it's votenader.org, and it has the 2008 independent agenda that I ran on, about 18 areas that were off the table, weren't even discussed by the Republicans and Democrats. Policies on corporate crime, full Medicare for all, for example, living wage, for example, but were discussed and promoted by my campaign. And they shut us out. The media shut us out. Even a lot of the independent media shut us out. Of course, PBS, NPR shut us out. But if you go to votenader.org, I've kept it open laboriously every year so you can look at the 18 or 19 long overdue changes in this country that are not even on the table to be discussed in debates between the Republicans and Democrats.
Just back to my question, would you have ever had the temperament to run for Senate from Connecticut and be under Chuck Schumer's thumb?
No, I would never have run as a knee-jerk Democrat in the first place. Chuck Schumer has been a great disappointment to a lot of Democrats here in Washington, D.C. We thought he'd be strategically impressive, tough, articulate, making news, and he's turned wimpy. McConnell is twirling him around his finger, Senator McConnell.
Yeah. Did you ever, at one point, think you could possibly win the presidency? Was there ever a moment where your ego got the best of you after a rally and thought, man, I might actually walk away with this thing? Was there ever a time?
No, obviously, because when you're not on the national presidential debates, when you're confronting the Electoral College, and when you're blacked out by the mass media, so most of the people don't even know you're running, even though they know what you've done over the years as a consumer and citizen advocate, how could I have those delusions?
Okay. All right, very good.
I once thought I was going to win Star Search. I'm serious. Actually,
and the lottery.
Thank you for your questions. Keep them coming on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website.
And that's a wrap. Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour when we talk to the founder of Appleseed Records, Jim Mullisman.
Stand up, you've been sitting way